Good, great. So the topic of today is identity politics in the Arab world, and there's so many, amazing, competent people in the chat. So if we just do brief introductions quickly of people that didn't introduce themselves last week. So Anna, Jonathan Fryer, Nick, Malu, for example, Loué. If you could just introduce yourselves briefly, that would be fantastic. So I don't know, Anna, do you want to go first, and then Jonathan next, and go like that?
Yeah, I'm Anna, Middle Eastern, and a visual artist working with issues of identity and dislocation using photos and moving image within installations. Can everybody hear?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Right, I think that's probably enough to go on.
Where in the Middle East, Anna?
Sorry?
Where in the Middle East?
Where am I from in the Middle East? But my grandparents are from Baghdad.
Oh, nice.
I don't know. Apparently not anymore.
I told my dad yesterday that I wanted to go to Baghdad, and he's like, now?
Apparently it doesn't look like Baghdad anymore.
Oh.
What I've heard from people who have been there and who knew previously. That's true probably of a lot of places in the Middle East.
And Jonathan, do you want to go next, Jonathan?
Okay. Yes, I'm Jonathan Fryer, writer and broadcaster specializing in Middle East and North Africa. Was with BBC World Service 20 years, but these days work mainly with Arab television channels. And I'm also a subject lecturer in humanities at SOAS.
Pleasure to meet you. Nick, have you sorted out your microphone? No, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. Just while you sort that out, Saya, perhaps. Yes, fantastic.
Yeah. Great. I'm a journalist and writer, and very interested in foreign affairs, including the Middle East, but also other places. I write for different papers and books periodically. That's me.
Thank you very much, Saya.
I'm Saya. I was born in Erbil, but I grew up in Norway, and I work as a performer and a theater maker. And I was accepted to study at SOAS this week, actually, so it's a funny coincidence. Yeah, that's it. So I'm Kurdish Norwegian.
Congratulations on the ethnicity as well, but mainly on.
Thanks.
Malu?
I'm a writer and editor. I live in London. My father's Jordanian. My mother's Filipino. I grew up in Ohio. I've spent probably, since the 1980s, I've lived in London. So there are a lot of different identities there. My books include, my novel came out in 2017 in the States. It's just come out in German, and there'll be an Arabic edition. It's called Mother of All Pigs. And I've done a series of anthologies, including Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Front Line, The Secret Life of Syrian Lingerie, usually working with wonderful co-editors. And that's me pretty much in a nutshell.
Pleasure to meet you. And then if we go with Saman, Loué, and then afterwards Khalifa, and then we can commence.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So Sama, originally from Sudan. I live in London. I work as a case worker with the refugees, and I graduated from SOAS here and University of Khartoum in Sudan.
Thank you, Samah. And Saman?
Hello, everyone. I'm Saman Omar, Anti-Bed Security Study Researcher. I live in Kurdistan Regional Governor. and yeah, I just wanted to participate and share a Kurdish perspective to the hot subject we're gonna to debate. So yeah.
Amazing. And then thank you very much. And then Khalifa, and then Luay, and then we'll start.
Okay, thank you. My name is Khalifa and I'm Sudanese. Actually, I'm economist by profession and training. I live in Sudan not these days because of this COVID-19. Actually, I'm stuck in New York, so that's it. Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you. And Luay?
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Thank you, first of all, for all of this, and it's great and a great pleasure meeting all of you. I'm Luay al-Mazri from Libya. I grew up in Libya, Egypt, and Turkey, and I moved to the United States in 2015 to pursue my degree in architecture, and now working in the practice. I started to get involved in activism and advocacy during the revolution in 2011, but took a break and now I'm back.
Pleasure to meet you. So just to give a brief introduction to Arab Research and Advocacy Bureau, we're a website that collates anything related to the Arab world, demographic data, opinion polls, expert analysis from lecturers, authors, academics, and it's free to access. And the objective behind this is to eliminate misunderstandings or misrepresentations of Arabs by introducing a nuanced debate that's free to access for everybody. We started these weekly calls during the Corona lockdown period, just to semi-thought for everyone's mental health, but also to explore some of these interesting themes. But these calls became quite popular, and we've decided to continue them. So today is about Arab identity politics. We want to discuss, is there any kind of internal racisms between Arab, external racisms, if colonialism still affects us in post-colonial territories, to what extent can North Africans identify with other Africans or participate in the Black Lives Matter movement, and so forth. So the rules are, yes.
So one correction to that is identity politics in the Arab world rather than Arab identity politics.
Yes, identity politics in the Arab world, correct. Yeah, so that, I think, Shatha, it's important what Shatha said, because we're focusing specifically on Arabs in North Africa and Middle East and their identity politics, as opposed to Arabs like many of us in this chat who live in Europe and America. We'll try to close at 8:30, and if you want to go next or respond to someone, please raise your hand and then we can go like that. So does anyone want to start? If not, I can start. So Shatha, do you want to, is there anything that you want to ask? Is there a particular point of discussion that you're grappling with?
So perhaps we could start by why did we even choose to speak about identity politics in the Arab world? And from, covering last week and the week before, we talked about religion and gender, self-expression, art. From these conversations, we talked a lot about identity, and identity not in the sense of the way it's fluidly constructed and structured, but more so how it is politicized and internalized based on the political institutions, economic institutions, and history that made us internalize who we are as if we exist in dichotomous relationships of these identities. So there seems to be this general sense that you are, if you're Arab, then you're not something else, or if you're African, then you're not something else. And there seems to be that zero-sum game of identity rather than it being fluidly, even though it is fluid. All of our identities are fluid, but there's so much politicization in the way that these identities are constructed. So hopefully this, at least for me, the objective of today's conversation could shed light on how I, for example, identify as a Libyan Arab, North African Muslim, when somebody else could, for example, look at me and say, but you do not look like any of these things, and how that could be challenged and therefore we can foster more of tolerance and more of accepting and embracing the differences rather than compartmentalizing our identities. So that's identity politics, at least how I look at it.
I have another point, if I may, Osama, also, in order to expand the perspective of our discussion tonight. I'd love to listen to everyone's perspective in terms of what are the factors that are shaping the identities in the Middle East. So in your mind, what are the major contributors to shaping these identities, especially if we expand the conversation to also include sectarianism and its how it is politicized in the Middle East, especially if we consider a book like Mapping Out the New Politics of the Middle East, which highlights the sectarianization rather than the sectarianism in the Middle East, which is by Nader Hashemi and Postel. So I would love to listen to everyone's views on this.
And another thing I want to explore as well is the extent to which Arab identity is a cultural phenomenon, a linguistic one, an ethnic one, or a combination of either of those. As we have, obviously, we have two Sudanese on the chat. We have also Angie, who is of Lebanese-Druze origin as well. And to what extent, perhaps maybe Saman and there was another Kurdish participant could explain, if they identify with the Arab world or if they see themselves as a distinct identity. So these are other themes as well that I want to explore.
So Osama, should we start with perhaps like addressing Hossam's question of if everybody can go around and just brainstorm what the contributors are to constructed identities?
Sure, yeah. I think Anna probably has a lot of opinions on this because her artwork specializes on identity and memory as well. So perhaps it'll be interesting to hear her perspective.
That was rather sudden. Thank you, Osama. I can only sort of talk about my own situation, and I think that I like the way in which Paul Gilroy, do people know Paul Gilroy? Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. But Paul Gilroy is a black British cultural theorist, lecturer, etc., etc. And he talked about the hyphenated identity. Mm-hmm. And I quite like that because it allows for continued sort of build up on this. So I think that the way that I see it mainly is around issues of dislocation, and that actually concerns anybody who has had to move from one country to another, or has even chosen to move from one country to another. Clearly, circumstances are going to make a difference to that as well. In my own situation, I find that as I learn new things about my circumstances, that also impacts on my life. And I think that this whole time in isolation, if you want, or more isolation than normal, there's a lot of room to start thinking around those issues. And that's actually has quite an effect. And that's why, in a way, I'm quite pleased to be here. Clearly, what's sort of going on in the world then impacts again on us. And again, it depends on where we are. So I think that it's, for me, it's a sort of developing theme. I think that the fact that Osama refers to my work, what I'm interested in is the notion that the fact that history is not just about the histories that have actually been written in the main by people in power, and in the main, the ones that I have actually, that I'm actually accessing most of the time is within a white Western world. So my own sort of feeling is that I want to redress that balance. And a lot of my work seems to be about using the term redressing the balance. So I'm interested in narratives of people that come from very different areas of life in London or wherever I find myself when I'm doing a piece of work, and trying in some way to expand expand their own sort of articulation of themselves, perhaps. I don't know if that, I don't mean that to sound in any way sort of arrogant, but really I'm in a position to give somebody an opportunity to tell a story, and I'm interested in hearing that story, and I'm then in a position to be able to pass that story on to other people. I think that's probably as much as I want to say at the moment. I might sort of enter into other discussions later.
Yes, Lawrence, please. Yeah.
Mute. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Hello. Good evening. Sorry, I was a bit late to it. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name's Lawrence Jaffe. I'm a senior advisor. I believe am I the only senior advisor?
A senior in knowledge, not in age, Lawrence.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so sweet of you. Thank you. Sometimes I think it's geriatric advisor, but anyway, here. So yes, and I know Osama because I used to be involved with a group called Arab Jewish Forum. I'm Jewish, not Arab, and Osama's Arab, and was on that. And anyway, I'm very proud of what's developed, especially the series of webinars. My own interest is, I wrote a book about the Middle East peace process back in 1996, talking of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, called maybe. It hasn't developed too far since then, unfortunately. But the point just to pick up the point that Anna made, quoting Paul Gilroy, was the question of multiple identities. And that's a fascinating topic, and I think that's true universally. But like, for instance, if you're Lebanese, you might be Maronite, you might be Druze, you speak Arabic. Where does Arab identity fit in that pecking order, as it were? I think with everybody, there's a different, almost like a personal, sometimes a national way of describing it. Hossam can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 100 years ago, many Egyptians would say, yes, we speak Arabic, but maybe they would speak of themselves as Egyptian first, Arab later. And then there's a position of Mizrahi Jews, for instance, those many who live in Israel, who sometimes call themselves Arab Jews, or Jews from the Arab land, or sometimes the terms are so politicized, they wouldn't identify as such. So just to throw that out about multiple identities, and Milou herself said she was born in America and her dad is from Jordan. So certainly feels Arab from that point of view, but in a sense, we're all negotiating our inner identities. And that's what I would say. I might just at the tail end, I'll just say, how important do you think language is in defining Arab identity? Thank you.
Osama, can I just come in with the hyphenated identity, which is quite different. I think that what Paul Gilroy refers to is not just in terms of where you've been in your life, or where your parents have been, or where your grandparents have been, but it's also a mix of what you do that actually also integrates itself within that identity. So I'm a visual artist. I've done community work. All of those things impact on my identity. So it's not just based on which countries my forefathers and foremothers came from, and how other people see me. It's also made up of what my life is about. And I think that's a very important point to take into consideration when one thinks about identity. Sorry, that's it, just to clarify.
And Anna, like, just adding on your point about hyphenated identity, I mean, this it reminds me of Du Bois' double consciousness, where like how Du Bois, African-American sociologist, who said that African-Americans have that hyphenated identity, right? They have this double consciousness that they have to see themselves as both Africans and Americans constantly, while other races, for example, the white race in that context, they don't need to see themselves as European Americans or Irish Americans. They can just be Americans because they're white. And I mean, and the concept of double consciousness, as Anna said, I mean, with the hyphenated identity can expand to refer to identities outside the African American racial and I guess national identity as well. So that's really interesting.
Yes.
This is very interesting. Okay, please go ahead, Laila.
No, doctor, it's okay.
Please, ladies first.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Laila. I'm talking to you today from Ramallah, Palestine. I'm Palestinian. And identity politics is so interesting. I would like to go further back, like from these conversations, I see all the identities which are identified currently are political, because for me, they stem from political structure. For example, if we talk about the Arab nation, if we talk about why are we called Arab, what did unite us in the first place? Was it the language? Was it the nomadic life we lived? Was it the contiguous piece of land which was called Arabia? Was it geography? Was it language? Was it habits? Was it norms? We had these like everybody had attributes, because when societies developed, they started developing in groups, and groups started identifying themselves as norms, as things they would do together, something that would unite them. And then came religion, and then came habits, and then came geography, atmosphere, and then everything that identified who the people are, why did they move from one place to another, what did they do for a living, why did they do that. For the Arab world, I see that it was completely political after being called Arabs, because when nation states came, when there were states in the first place, especially for the Middle East, we were Levantine. Like, it wasn't before the 19th, start of the 20th century, we were Levantine. We were not Palestinian. We were Palestinian. We were referred to as Palestinians because we lived in the land Palestine, but there was nothing actually that said we are Palestinians per the states or the borders, because everybody was everybody. My grandfather, he had cousins in Lebanon. He was connected to the Upper Galilee in Palestine, and then he came what is called now West Bank. So he was Levantine before he became Palestinian. Palestinian became a political term to identify historical Palestine we talk about, and referring to what Lawrence was saying. And this is part of the confusion when somebody identify as Jew, but not Israeli, Jew, Arab. And it was really interesting. I was in a bus going to Tel Aviv once. I was going for a visa and something, and somebody was talking. I was talking with my friend, and somebody overheard us, and he was talking to us. He was a very nice man. And then he spoke in really Arabic, and in a different Arabic language, was more than like Lebanese. And I was so interested. I wanted to know, who is he? What is he doing going to Tel Aviv? And apparently he was a Lebanese Jew who was in Lebanon before in the 70s, and then he moved into Israel to live there. And the question that came to my mind, what made him go to Israel for being that, was what drove him to his religious identity rather than his nationalistic, for example. And this is how politics played a role. So for me, it goes back beyond these identifications where identity became politics, and then it was used for politics, and this is how it becomes. So for me, I would identify as an indigenous kind of people who are fighting for the right to be on my land. And for me, it doesn't matter if I'm Jewish, Christian, or Muslims, because there were Jewish from like hundreds of years who are living in Palestine. For me, these are Palestinians because they live on the land, they belong to the land, and they own their houses and their lives, etc., etc. So it's not about that in general. So in a sense, sometimes I would like to break down these identities and not go by the political identification of such identities, and then to break them down. For example, some Christians in Palestine would relate to European or to the Pope more than they would relate to being Palestinian, and vice versa. So why would that happen? And then I would think it's the personal attributes where somebody identify, or like Shatha said at the start, is how we were brought up to be like this. Like, I didn't choose to be this, but I was born this way, and then I adopted it because this is how I was indoctrinated, or this is how I was taught. So for me, it's all about the politics of the place and how you identify with reality and your personal attributes. Like, I am born Christian, but then I would become Christian by choice, or I would say that's not the thing for me. So for me, it's the initial struggle of, shall I admit to the politics of the identity I was given, or shall I analyze it or break it down further? Because it is a complex. We're not just one thing. We're human beings with all these attributes, social, spiritual, let me say, not even religious, mental. I could relate to, I don't know, a music band in Thailand because they identify with what I want to hear or what I want to read, etc., etc. Like, I love Japanese novel. What does make the connection, or art, etc. In the case of Anna and everybody else. So for me, it's the breakdown of these attributes into something that's related to me, and trying to break down the politics of what was imposed on us at some point.
I think one of the points you made that really was very interesting for me was the fact that many Christians in the Arab world identify with Europe on the basis of their Christianity. And I think it's interesting that the Judeo-Christian identity is closer to European identity than a Muslim one, arguably anyway. I know that every identity is subjective, but many people would have that opinion. And I think the reason I find this dynamic interesting, not only is it because Christianity and Judaism also started in the Middle East, and the origins are the same as the Muslim identity, but perhaps this was a move that was catalyzed by the Roman Empire and the association of Christianity with Europe. So I want to explore what, obviously, Jonathan Fryer perhaps has a few insights on this as a lecturer. Do you teach identity modules in your course at SOAS, for example?
Absolutely, yes. Identity is a totally core issue of the sociology module of humanities. And we see it in terms of individual identities and collective identities, listening with great interest to much of the discussion so far on collective identities. Perhaps I'd like also to throw in a different perspective, in the sense that one can see identity also as layers of an onion, not just matters of hyphens, but different layers, and you show different layers according to the context in which you are.
And do you think that there are more layers or more complications with identity? For example, I know the topic is about Arabs in the Arab world and their identity politics, but do you think Arab diaspora or Arab migrants in the West have more layers by birth circumstance, in your point of view?
Possibly it would depend on the case. I mean, obviously, you know, there are Arab British or Arab Americans, for example, but within the Arab world itself, I think we have to acknowledge that the Arab world is far more multicultural than we sometimes assume. And particularly amongst Westerners, there's often this gross assumption that the Arab world is entirely made up of Muslims and all Arab, pure Arabs, whereas we know that's not the case. And even with Islam, there are many different types. And it's interesting, we've got a couple of people with a Kurdish connection, because obviously they're an area that I've done a lot of work on. I wrote a book about Iraqi Kurdistan. There is a real interesting challenge for people, positive in many cases, as in Iraqi Kurdistan, but deeply problematic in some other parts of the Arab world, including in Syria.
Yeah, if I may add on that, Jonathan, I agree, and that's why I always I don't like to say the Arab identity, but more identities in the Arab world, and for that exact reason. For example, in Libya, I did my research on the discourse of identity in the discourse of political identity in the context of Libya during the uprising of 2011, and I was surprised to learn that in the south, so like the Tuareg and the Tabu, which are other ethnicities that are not Arab nor Amazighi, they call them nomads, which I find that term quite problematic. So like the Tuareg and the Tabu, because of political project, at some part of history, the Gaddafi regime chose to give them national identities, so not an actual citizenship. So by that, they became Libyans, by the paradigm of the nation state, if that's how we're going to frame identity. And then in the other groups were not given that citizenship card that says they are Libyan. So in that, from that frame of work, they don't have a citizenship. And so if they don't have a citizenship, what does that say about that layered identity? What do they refer to? So Libya as an Arab state of 4 ethnicities, it's still considered an Arab state with, I mean, we're like 4 ethnicities, and that's never even talked about. So I agree with what you said, and I think that's there's political reasons to why we choose to talk about the nation state as a frame of identity. And to add on that, like especially with the Kurdish case, Sykes-Picot decided to just divide the entire region so that we became these little nations that now we identify with these little nations, and now we fight amongst ourselves about these nations, when it's just literally a French and a British man came together and looked at the map and said boom boom, Sykes-Picot, and now we have nation states. So
however, may I jump on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
In Libya and North Africa. So, and speaking of imperialism in general and how it identified identity for that region that was continuously throughout the history colonized by different imperialisms, and it took them hundreds of years to rewrite the identity of the region. So in Libya, for instance, when before the Greek and the pharaohs, there was a Libyan, native Libyan empire. And then the pharaohs came, and after hundreds of years, Libyans, the native Libyans, became associated with the pharaohs as pharaoh leaders, and became pharaoh leaders and became part of that imperialism. And the same with the Greek, the same with Roman, and the same with the Islamic Empire, which the Arab used as part of their spread. So when the Muslim empire was spreading all over the region, Arabs and others were migrating and changing location. Now, fast forward all the way to after dividing the lands and deciding that this is called Libya. When Libya was founded, it was called the Nation of Libya. It wasn't called the Nation of Arab Libya. There wasn't such a thing. When they made a race, they ran a race. When they gathered the race data, they had Arabs and then non-Arabs who became Arabs, and then the Amazigh and Tabu, Tuareg, and the other races. Now, let's stop at the non-Arabs who became Arabs. Now that's where everything changed moving forward when Gaddafi's regime came, because he said there is no non-Arabs who are Arabs. There is no other ethnicities. It's just Arabs, and we are part of the Arab nation. We're not the Libyan nation. So I just wanted to share that, and I wonder if that's the case in the rest of the region.
Sure, Saman, did you wanted to say something on this point?
Hello again. Yeah, so actually I'm a Kurd, and I would like to share my understanding of the debate. As a Kurd, after as Ms. Shatha just mentioned, after Sykes-Picot, even the nation we live with, and even the international community, they didn't recognize our, let's say, nationality, our rights, and we get struggle until in a southern Kurdistan. I mean, in Iraq now, after 1991 and uprising, we have a governor, and we share with the new Iraqi after regime 2003, and in KRG nowadays, we have a multi-identity. They live with us, Arab, Turkoman, and yeah, some Jewish. But actually, we have community security, and each nation they share and they express freely, and their language and their habit and their what they believe accept. We have kind of peace and tolerance between all who live in KRG. But actually, I would like to say, and I will appear a question, which is, can anybody try to answer the threats to the national identity, okay, in even today or in upcoming decade, let's say, and how we gonna to promote our national identity based in the, let's say, the understanding and non-military act, okay? So isn't gonna be okay if we promote our, let's say, the method or tools that help us to promote the, let's say, to keep our national identity safe? Isn't civil engagement, cultural dialogue, and building inclusive institution? Yeah, I'm here to answer if there is any question. Here my whole point. Thank you for time.
Thank you very much. I think you raised a couple of points were raised that were very interesting about by yourself and by Louay, about the extent to which Arab identity is socialized and is the result of imperialism. And I think this is it's a sensitive topic, but I think it's important to have it because whilst I agree with Shatha that a lot of our identity conflicts are the result of post-colonial dynamics in the Middle East and the division of the area, I still think that we are, and well, I say we, Arab leaders are to an extent still responsible for managing their instabilities appropriately to not allow these identity conflicts to get out of control. So when
you say Arab leaders, who's that?
Yeah, well, they haven't changed much. Like there's 25 people since forever.
So are we talking government leaders?
Yes.
Are we talking? Okay.
Yes, because you can't have all the right, especially if you're undemocratically elected, you can't assume all the rights and all the fruits and benefits of being a leader without having the responsibility to unpick some of these very complicated situations. I still think, even though a lot of us may not view these leaders as legitimate, I still think that we should hold them to account in terms of how they manage situations. I guess a good example is, again, it's a controversial one, but it's the Iraq War. Of course, the intervention of Britain and of America was not good. It shouldn't have happened. It was on a false premise and it destabilized the region. At the same time, I do also believe that Saddam Hussein, through his own identity politics, through his oppression of the Kurds, and so forth, he played right into the hands of America to fabricate stories and to intervene on a false basis. So he was also a diplomatic failure, in my opinion. As much as we do blame America, we still need to look at the way we manage our circumstances as well. I'm not sure if anyone, perhaps Nick does a lot of research on this, if he has an opinion on this, for example.
Osama, I feel I'm sort of scraping the surface of this very, very interesting discussion, actually. Osama, I mean, I don't think I can offer anything very helpful. I feel as somebody who's sort of not part of the Arab world, I actually feel I'm hearing some incredibly interesting things, but I'm not quite sure how to respond to them right now as a Jew and someone with lots of skepticism about, identity politics as a concept even. as a sort of Marxist, I wonder whether identity can be used to divide people rather than, find unity between oppressed classes.
Very interesting.
That's just a passing thought at this point.
So may I jump in?
Yeah.
So here's the thing: when we say Arab, who are we talking about? Because if we may, it's not the Arab world. It's not the Arab land. We know where the Arab land is geographically and historically. It's in my view, how we can preserve the identity geographically of these places, and coming from a place like Libya, and the unfairness that and injustice that the Amazigh and Tabu and Tuareg and non-Arabs went throughout the history, and especially in the last period of time. It's either that we call it Arab world in that area where it is the Arab world, and then that area, that region of North Africa is just North Africa, and then Mediterranean is just Mediterranean, and Libya itself is just Libya itself. It doesn't matter who or what are the components. The components are here in this piece of land, and we gotta identify ourselves and help each other dig and search our history and present the identity of our ancestors, because this land was deprived from expressing its own identity, coming from various places and various ethnicity.
And that's interesting, because there's the concept of, I don't know if you guys know about it, but the concept of territorialization in relation to identity. So re-territorialization and de-territorialization, and that often happens as people move. And a lot of times when we look at our identities as it relates to land or territory, there seems to be the need of preserving that identity as it relates to the land. And then if we're trying to figure out identity in the sense of our ancestors, then really is it an individual responsibility to dig into the ancestry and find out who, for example, who do I identify with? Who am I based on, should I define who am I based on the land, the territory that I was born in, the territory that I live in, or the territory of my family and the history of my family, or the ancestors? Because I think these are different questions. And the following question on that is, do we need to? Do we need to do that?
This relates to my question I wanted to ask Shatha, actually, and to what Jonathan was saying about collective memory. It's the collective memory of the groups. It's the collective memory of communities. It's the collective memory of religion. And if you go, I cannot remember the writer who was talking about how identity came about and how religion even came about. It's the collective identity of people, and then how nation states came. They became part of the political cycle of empires, of invasions, of imperialism, which then was conducted into borders, let's say. And the question comes in here is whether we need to conform to that or not. So going to what I was saying about Arabs, does the Arab world define everybody in the Arab world or not? Or was it a political one to dominate this piece of land? And the other question, shall we separate on this basis or not? So the question is now, there's a huge trend in the world is accepting everybody, diversity, but what does diversity mean in that sense? Does it mean that Palestine needs to have everybody in it? Does it mean that Libya has a place where everybody, Arabs and non-Arabs, nomads, Amazigh, whatever there was, is there in that collective sense? Or shall we ask, like what's going on in Spain, being part of the Mediterranean, where Catalans want to separate? Are we saying that each group needs to separate from each other because they have a distinct identity, or shall a form of state include them? And does it have to be the same identical, like political identification of that identity or state? So, for example, with the Iraqi and the Kurds, and I would disagree with Osama, because eventually the Arab world must have collapsed, either with the outsiders or not. They didn't have the right at any time to go in. They went there for their own interest. But the question is, if they waited a bit more, would the people stay the same? If we waited until Saddam died on his own, I don't know how would that happen, but still, even Mubarak in Egypt, even in Palestine, even in Jordan, and talking about all the Arab countries, if it would happen. So the question is, would we keep the Arab states as they are now? What do we need to change? Does it mean we would love to separate? I mean, is it Iraq without the Kurds inside it? I don't know. It's a question to everybody. And is it the same? Do we need to separate to identify ourselves, or do we need that kind of capsule, if it's called a state or a nation, and it's like that kind of layers of the onion that Jonathan was speaking about? Do I have to be an onion, or do I want to peel and I just want one layer of that and I don't want the others? And I hope this makes sense.
Oz, could I jump in here?
Sure, yes, Sean. Just one thing. I think there was a question from Sama. So if we can get that, and also I wanted to bring Saya in, and then please ask your question afterwards. So apologies, Sean, apologies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's no question actually. It's a comment. It's a comment or answer of the question. That do we need to identify ourselves? And returning back to someone's question about our national identity, do we need to keep our national identity? I think, in my opinion, I think there is nothing. There is nothing called like our national identity, and we have to keep it, and we have to save it, because I think the identity concept is something like we can't control, and I think people are free. So if you go and say we need to keep our national identity, we need to save this, we need to force that, we need to force to not do that, so I think something will go wrong by forcing and controlling. So if people are free, you will see things nourishing, you will see it going to positive direction. And I think if the one wants to explore their identity and dig, it's individual thing. I think everyone in this life is going in his life trying to find out, trying to explore, trying to develop themselves. So I think already they will go and see and dig about their history, ancestors, and also I think the identity also changing. For example, when I was in Sudan, because of the society and because of the government policy, in my mind I had thinking about my identity, and when I came here I had time to sit with myself, I had time to mix with people, and I found common things with people that I wouldn't find when I was in Sudan. So it's changing and it's accumulating over time.
It's just before Saya comes in, it's interesting that you believe that we can't control identity, whereas Anna believes that our actions and our lifestyle and activities contribute to identity, which we partially control. So I'm already seeing like a diversity in opinion on this, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I have a point that I'd like to share on this, if I may, and also I think other vital points in order to
can Sean ask his question, and then Hussam, you go next?
Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to listen to this so far. I just wanted to make one quick observation in that I've been tying together sort of the thread of various people's comments in a way. Well, one thread in everyone's comments that really spoke to me in terms of, I know Lawrence made a comment about the kind of conflict between Arab and Jewish identity. Someone also alluded, I believe it was Shatha, to the conflict between Africa, like why is it that African Americans have to identify in that way? And there was talk about imperialisms and how they've shaped identities. And later on, someone mentioned that, you know, is from a Marxist perspective, perhaps, are all these identities just a manifestation of various oppressions? To what extent are these identities things that we consented to, that are rather than forces of history, often oppressive ones? I mean, I was having a conversation earlier today with the wife of a rabbi I knew quite well at university, on her the comment thread of one of her Facebook posts, which is probably where a disproportionate amount of my conversations take place these days. And she was saying, you know, why, you know, we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and the conversation kind of ended up going to Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi, Jewish identity, and to what extent there are white Jews, brown Jews, black Jews. And some people actually took real offense to the idea that they could be white and Jewish, because they said, if you look at the kind of the history almost of European civilization, it's been an attempt to exclude Judaism and Jewish identity from whiteness, if you like. We're painted as imposters. There's so many layers to this, but yeah, I mean, to what extent do we, and Summer actually preempted my point very nicely there when she asked, you know, people are free, are they not? And yeah, to what extent do we consent to these labels, and should we continue to identify them? I know it's quite a broad point, but it really resonated with me.
Assam, do you wanna?
Yeah, all of these are very interesting points, definitely, and they are worth thinking about and reflecting on. But like given like in view of the trajectory that we have set for the conversation, there are just very few number of points that I'd like to highlight. Definitely, when we speak of identity and identity politics, there are power relations involved, and there are power relations involved in the sense that there are certain sources, if I may put it this way, that aim to set a certain discourse, as a result of which certain identities are raised, or as a result they are constructed. So of course identities are fluid, and they can be manipulated, and they can be instrumentalized, they can be politicized. With that being said, and speaking in particular of the Middle East, definitely the scene seems to be very complicated because of the history of the Middle East, because of the importance of the Middle East, because of the strategic significance of the Middle East, because of the presence of the State of Israel in the Middle East. All of these are factors definitely that shape the importance and the significance of the Middle East. And this is why, like, from my exploration of the literature on the Middle East and the politics of identities in the Middle East, it is very obvious that now there is almost a consensus in the Western circles and especially in the Western academia, that now the Middle East has to move toward nation states again. And I can cite, for example, how clearly was the role of the State of Israel when it comes to the independence of in Iraq, the independence of which part, that which has Kirkuk.
I'm not sure. Maybe our Kurdish friends will know.
What do you mean? So I can help maybe.
He's asking about the independence of a particular part.
Yeah, you are in
Kurdistan, in Kurdistan. So we could see how Israel, for example, was very keen to push forward the agenda that they have the right to be independent and to have their own nation state. So this brings about the idea that what role does the elite play in the Middle East? Do they have to keep silent about this and see this form of balkanization of the Middle East, or they have a role to play in this regard?
But just very quickly, Hussam, do you agree though that the elite that are dictating the identity politics in the Middle East are not just Western? There are also Arab elites that have geopolitical interests that are contributing to this dynamic.
And what I mean by the elites here, I mean the educated ones, the academics, the intellectuals. So do they really have a role to play, and how can this role be affected, and especially given, like I have mentioned earlier, the complexity of the scene in the Middle East? And also I'd love to listen to your thoughts, whether or not you agree that this is how the region is pushed. It is pushed again towards nation states again, and every state has to have its own identity, its own interests, its own borders. It cannot interfere in any other countries' affairs. Tunisians have to have their own parliament and all their own special concerns, irrespective of others. So I'd love to listen to all your thoughts about this.
Thank you, Hussam. So next we'll have, because we have 30 minutes left, so I want to make sure that everybody's opinions is heard and everybody spoke. So Zreba, I know, wanted to comment on identity. So Zreba, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Greetings, good evening, and good morning, everyone, in your respective locations. I wanted to say, so my mother is actually a historian, and one of the things that she actually used to say about identity and politics is that we found throughout history that the strongest drivers of people are nationalism, politics, and then race. And typically what we've seen is that these drivers actually move people to start wars, to wage conflicts, start like relations with people, but they also allow opportunities for people to build and connect. And I think actually that's an interesting question, and I think from a philosophical place, like how do you identify? I actually currently live in America, and I am the product of both the East and the West. My mom is African-American Creole from the state of Louisiana, which has a long history of, if you go back to the inception of the United States, imported slaves from Africa and then colonized them for the use of building materials and buildings, and as the empire that we know that is America today. And then my father is a Libyan who originates in Tripoli. And so it was always in a kind of an interesting kind of experience actually growing up in a house with two cultures, literally. And I remember actually when I went to Libya for the first time, I think in 2017, I think I told my mom, one, she was upset with me. She was like, "Why are you going to Libya?" She was like, it's a scary country right now. They're in the middle of a war. And I was like, well, you go when you go. If you die, you die. You know, that's what it is.
Zreba, I would like to ask, as someone of half Creole, half Black, half Libyan identity, what do you think that North Africans can identify as Black, in your opinion?
I would say, I can't speak for all North Africans. I can speak for myself. And I would say that essentially when people would ask, they're like, "Oh, do you consider yourself Black or Arab?" And I would say, well, I'm super Black. Because my mother is African American, and then my father is from Africa, literally straight from Africa. So anything, and people would say, I said, it's really interesting, whatever. They're like, sometimes you act super Black, and then sometimes you act super Arab. and they literally can happen in the same conversation. So it's not necessarily, I think, how you identify, I think, with what culture, because I always subscribe that I am not half and half anything. I'm actually just whole and whole. Go ahead, sir.
Very interesting.
Sorry, may I just highlight one thing? Black is many identities, and white is many identities. Those are just colors. That was all I wanted to say.
Yeah, my question.
That's a fair point.
Also, Arab is not Arab as Arab. Like, there's so many going on. So
yeah.
My question is deliberately provocative. It was deliberately simplified to see what the answer would be. That's why I asked it.
Okay, so now should we? Zreba, did you finish your thoughts or?
Essentially, I think I always like what my barber used to say. Was one, he was like, I don't care. He said, I don't care what color you are or where you're from. He said it in a less eloquent way, but he said, if you're one of the 16 shades of black, then you're black. That's literally what he used to say, because he said a lot of times we are always considered, at least here in America, we're considered the other because we don't identify with the American version of white people. I know that they're different from the Anglo-Saxons who live in Britain, who live in Ukraine and the Slavic countries and things like that. And that's essentially, I think that's just my experience actually living here in the South in the United States.
Yeah, you never upset your barber. Somebody who messes with your hair, you just don't mess with them.
May I come in, please?
Sure. And then if we can hear Saya's perspective afterwards, so please come in, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think this is like really interesting discussion, and it's for us in Sudan, actually, it has like a great relevance. You know, for us, we're still not sure how we see ourselves, like either collectively or like individually. So we have to know who we are, and that actually has a lot of problems. So for us, the issue of like identity and the identity politics really has significance. And for us, you know, for most of Sudanese now, I think some of them, they identify themselves like as African, other identify themselves as Arab, and we have like said group identify themselves as Nubians, which actually for us is creating a lot of problems. And now this kind of identity is being politicized, and that has like many layers. So for example, maybe initially we have this kind of politicization, Muslims versus Christians. And that then ended up with this, we have this secession of South Sudan. Then we move to like another layers. Now we have the Arabs versus African, and maybe versus Nubians. So this thing actually is really, really of great importance for us. And this kind of even politicization of this identity, actually it's harmful for us. We lost the South, and now maybe we are on the track to lose Darfur region, because some people now, they say, oh, well, now it's Arab and African. And the irony is that, you know, it's very difficult for you to distinguish between who is Arab and who is Africans. And this actually what Kofi Annan was once said. He went to Darfur, and it's like the problem is between Arab and Africans, and he said which is which. I mean, so the issue of this identity and politicization, actually it's of great importance for us. And I think we still have to find a way to identify ourselves either collectively or even on individual basis. Otherwise, and the problem, as most of you were mentioning, is really the identity is kind of a fluid concept. I mean, like personally now, I don't know who am I? I don't know how to identify myself. Like even within my family, some of them, they define themselves as Arabs, others they identify themselves with African. So I think that's really what I wanted to just to say. And at the end of the day, maybe we need to move to we need to create some sort of I don't know, national story, national lullaby, something that we can just hold on apart from our ethnicity or our religion or our maybe color or whatever. Thank you.
Saya, right?
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Just asking as a reflection, when does it become important to be called Arab or to call someone Arab? So, for example, when people immigrate to a Western country and they become a minority, then it's nice to create a bigger minority community by calling everyone Arab, and that way we are together. You know, there's that idea of now we're together and we're strong and we're not just small groups against the big society. But when we talk about, just going back to basics, like when we talk about cuisine or accents, whether we like the cuisine or whether we like the accents or not, that's when we start, again, separating each other. This is Moroccan, this is A, B, and C. So again, so culturally, we are different. And then, for example, from a Kurdish perspective, I lived in Kurdistan, Iraq for 3 years. I lived in Syria, Dimashq, for 3 years, and then I grew up in Norway, but I call myself Kurdish Norwegian. And then I wonder, would I have called myself Kurdish Syrian? Because I don't identify with Iraqi. And what I've experienced is that whenever Kurds have been called Arabs, it's when they use it as an argument to why we should not become an independent state, because we are part of this nation, or in other cases Turkish or Iranian. But when they kill Kurds, that's when they become Kurds again. They're not Arabs anymore. So I'm an actor in the acting industry. Whenever there's a casting for a Muslim character, they go Arabs, we're looking for Arabs. But I'm not Muslim, I'm Zoroastrian. And so someone who's Vietnamese would have been better for that part, but being Arab, again, because it's so it's easy to identify, because that's, you know, you have Lawrence of Arabia, that's the title we remember. We have Osama bin Laden, like we associate them with Islam and not someone who's Vietnamese. And so it's more who's it easy for politically as well. When you say Arab world, when you say Arabs, Islam world, I don't feel like someone's talking about me, because historically the perspective is so different from an Arab's point of view. So going back to, you know, the Saddam Hussein thing, when people say that Americans and British people interfered, it's very confusing for me. My mom was secretly worked in Amnesty International during that time, and she was one of 5 who collected information from prisoners, Ba'athist victims of torture, and they collected all this information, sent it to the West to say, this is happening, come and help us. There was also an incident where, along with thousands of other Kurds, they were in this, they had like walked for 4 days fleeing from the Ba'athist soldiers, and was right under a helicopter that was shooting at Kurds and just waiting to be killed, until this American plane came, which was sent by George W. Bush the first, and the helicopter immediately, you know, got away. So when you say Americans intervened, from my perspective, it was Americans came and rescued my mother. So again, whose perspective is this coming from? Why do people in the West, you know, there are a lot of communists and a lot of socialists in Norway, and they genuinely believe in this. They're not saying it because it's cool, but they say that there were no chemical weapons in Iraq, and that confuses me. So I'm like, am I thinking about the same chemical weapons as you do? Because there's actual footage of victims of, you know, the people who were killed by chemical weapons.
So you agree that it's more complicated than...
It's very complicated.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point I was trying to make.
But at the end of the day, I think being called Arab is important for people who want to be part of a bigger community, from my perspective. And it's sometimes important to control politics, but it's also important from the Western society. So for example, you know, saying Black people rather than Nigerian, Caribbean, Somalian, it's easier to put us in that one group, because, you know, it's for me, calling me Arab is like, you wouldn't call Scottish people English. that would feel like you're removing their whole history. And I have big respect for Arabs. Like I have nothing against Arabs. I love the culture. Syria is still close to my heart.
The food.
I also, you know, I identify with something else. So I feel more Kurdish, Norwegian than Iraqi, you know.
And Saya,
you bring speak Arabic, Saya?
شوية بس مو كلش زين.
Saya, I wanted to highlight something that you brought about that's very important, and that's the inclusion when we speak about a particular region or culture. And there seems to be an understanding of culture that mostly is based on its aesthetic understanding of cultures, and aesthetic in the sense of what can come out, what can we quantify, the culture that can be quantified and seen, and seen can be tasted and can be heard. And yes. It does not incorporate the anthropological culture of that region, and that is the onion analogy that was used. And so, like, I mean, this is something that I've started to find very interesting. I'm beginning research on it. Is cultural policy, drafting cultural policy, nation states. If we're gonna operate from the frame of a nation state, right? We have economic policy, we have a tourist policy, we have all policies by the state, right? But we don't have cultural policies, and not many states have actually drafted cultural policies. And so if we have more research on how can we draft an inclusive cultural policy that brings about and incorporates the aesthetic and the anthropological culture of whether that is a state, a nation, or a region. So in that case, being Kurdish is not excluded from saying Arab, and not, for example, Arab in the sense of having ethnically identified with. Okay, well, who's calling me right now? I'm sorry.
No worries.
You get the point, though.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say I would have identified more with Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. So, like from an academic point of view, I understand that. From a personal point of view, I would say Mesopotamia. You know, and then now modern times has become Iraq and Syria, etc. And that's, you know, respectable. Like, times change, things change, but hopefully we could fix things within each other.
I think now we have, who's next? Angie and Laila, right?
Hi.
Oh, Saman, okay.
How do we book time? Do I write in the chat?
Please,
yeah, you can write in the chat, yeah.
I think we're going to have to extend by 10 minutes as well to fit everything. So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to do Saman, then Angie, then Laila, and then I think Lawrence has something to say, and then I guess Luay.
Sorry, after Lawrence, Jonathan.
Jonathan.
To clarify a distinction on something, yeah.
Okay, thank you. تحياتي أستاذ حسام. Arab close for us.
Very popular, Hussam.
And yeah, but let me start by our referendum. So still the question in our mind, why court even in international arena they don't recognize us and we don't have, without nation, we live without nation. In Iraq, even after regime Ba'ath regime mentality. Even nowadays, we can hear voices that deny us, but at the end, we could still struggle to protect our identity, and at the same time, we respect and we the value of the humanity and the principles of a democracy. And actually, we kind of understanding the Kurdish question kind of at an impasse, or there is no, let's say, way. Even we live in such arena or such time. The United Nations, let's say, the responsible to that concept of human security, and so, but in Iraq, court struggled, and we try to let get survive from the regime, and then the new threat was the Islamic State, Iraq and the Levant, and we struggle, we keep our identity safe, but actually we're suffering. So I absolutely agree with Sa. She just shared about our identity in an academic way. So we belong to the Mesopotamia, and we have, let's say, we have own language, and let's say the religion, but yeah, so it's like that. But we daily under the threat, and we upcoming, we don't know how thing goes, but once we held and we raise our voice, we get threatened, and we get destroyed. So hopefully let's say the open mind of Arab in Iraq, they understood our question and our matter and our story for freedom. That's all we need. Yeah, thank you.
I think now Angie, right? Unmuted myself. I definitely agree with what Saya said about, I grew up in diaspora from the start. So I grew up in, like, my parents are from Lebanon, but I spent my whole life in New York City. And so when there's this kind of like if you only stick like, oh, I'm Lebanese and that's it, like that's my identity as a whole. Unless you're in an area that's also like all Lebanese people, like by chance, like you're gonna be isolated. And so when you have this sort of like blanket term of Arab, it gives you an opportunity to connect to like a broader community. And like there is some overlap because like it's a bunch of like, I call it Arabized areas. Like regarding like Lebanon specifically, like they like to say that, oh, like we're not Arab, we're Phoenician, which is something that we touched on in the last talk. It's like one of my biggest pet peeves, honestly, because like where's Phoenicia right now? And then on top of like, if you want to say we're Phoenician, if like a Syrian person is like, oh, like the coast is also, we used to be Phoenicia, the Lebanese are like, no, like only, you know, it's like, and I find that it's normally like the Christian population in Lebanon that has that, like, we're not Arab, we're Phoenician, because they also associate like Arab with Muslim. And so the Christians in Lebanon are like, ew, I don't want to be, you know, Muslim. And being Druze specifically, D-R-U-Z-E, for anybody who may not know what that is, people always think I'm saying like Jewish. And they're like, you're an Arab Jew? And I'm like, no. And again, also growing up in diaspora, like I personally still connect to like the general like culture of like Islam, just because like growing up here, the people, like sometimes I would connect more with a non-Arab Muslim than I would with like an Arab Christian or something. Just culturally, like and we came from Islam, which a lot of Druze tend to forget. We came from Shia. And the religion also originated in Egypt, in Cairo. And so, but like if you ask, like, you know, there are even Druze in the States that like they lie to about their religion to like non-Druze people. It's very secretive. So it's just like the identity in itself is like already so complicated, because like, are we Muslim, are we not? Some people think we're Muslim, some people think we're not. And then in the States, given also like the negative stigma against the Islamic community, like American Druze are even more like, oh no, we're not that. Like, we're not that, no. And so like growing up, like I was always kind of confused. And then even like people kind of have, in the Western world, they have this like Arabs look one way. And so Isaiah's like, yes.
I'm so white.
and so for me, I got kind of adopted by like the mixed and Hispanic communities, because people in New York always think I'm Puerto Rican. And I always joke that I'm like a perceived Latina, but yeah, and so yeah, like I always grew up kind of confused, and like I was 6 years old when 9/11 happened, and so from the get-go, my like willingness, I guess, to connect to like Arabness or, you know, whatever, it was kind of like, so when people would think I'm like they would think I'm like Puerto Rican, I would just be kind of like, yeah, like I wanted to kind of like distance myself because there was so much negative stigma, and I was young, you know, so and like I had to answer questions of like, oh, why are your people like this, you know, like if someone brought up terrorism, everyone in the class is like, and I'm like, I didn't do it. Like what do you, I'm not the spokesperson for this, like
Can I ask?
Yeah, what's up?
Can I ask Angie? So Nick raised a really fascinating point that identity is often linked to survival. So I'm thinking now about minority groups like the Druze or the Kurds. Do you think that kind of strict rules on Druze intermarriage, for example, that you spoke about last week, is that linked to a desire, or some kind of evolutionary desire for that group to survive as a minority group?
Oh, absolutely. And especially given that there's no conversion, like nobody can, if you're not born Druze, like you can't become Druze. And so like there's this kind of like pressure, like, oh, we have to save the community, or like save, because we're already so small, and if everyone's marrying outside, the kids aren't Druze anymore. So that's definitely, and even like that's why like for the Druze that live in Israel, maybe I shouldn't put the Israel, I tend to do like Israel, but and like if you ask them they'll be like, oh no, we're not Arab, you know. But I feel like even just that statement in itself is kind of for survival, because associate, like they don't want to be treated as Palestinians are, and so by being like, oh, like we're more like the Jews, like it's a kind of a way for like, okay, like you guys can live, you guys, we won't bother you, you guys fight in our, you know, in the IDF and like whatever. So I feel like definitely survival plays a huge part.
Angie, I'm so happy I'm speaking after you. You just stood up the points so high. I don't know where to start, but I'll start with a funny thing. My sister lives in the US. Whenever we're bored, she would say, "Oh, would you like me to take you to the Arabs? It's like a community that you go and have fun where you self-identify." But I think identities and identity politics for the people, for the communities themselves, is about survival. This is how the imagined communities came on in the first place. When you think about it, it's the same for the Christians in Palestine. It's the same for the Jews. It's the same for the, and it's related to the, I think, the collective identity of religions. And when you bring up this Jews, I mean the Druze people in Palestine, they face a big dilemma of identifying themselves as wherever they are, because their religion stems from so many different origins. We don't really, I mean, Palestinians would say they would get where Jews come from, but they don't, to be honest. And it's and it's the way it's portrayed. And I have a dear friend who is Druze. He lost his brothers, one in Lebanon as a soldier and one in the First Intifada as a soldier.
Sorry.
And then he himself, he became a prisoner to the Palestinians, detainees at the Israeli presence, Israeli occupation presence. Sorry, I cannot say Israel without saying occupation. And then when he talked to the Palestinians, he discovered his Palestinian identity and his origins. He quit, and then he became a lawyer to the Palestinian detainees. And now he's having the fight of his life doing that. And it's really interesting because it goes back, I want to be concise because of time, and I want to go to what Hussam was talking about, elites and forming the politics of the identities. But actually this is how it became when nation states started to come, printing and the journals and reading, because elite used to do that. This is how they controlled the nations. This is how they did the hierarchy of who does what. And then when the, what do you call them? The royal state came, or when the religion was head of state, they took advantage of those readers, of those intellects who controlled also the nation states. And I think this also connects to many writers who spoke about the cultural roots of imagined communities. For example, Anderson, or a recent book by Noah Harari, the Homo sapiens, who talked about also the origin of how it became, the story of imagined communities and how it became. And it was so interesting for me to read about Bilad Rafidin. I don't know how to speak it in English. I don't want to mess up. It's too late. And it's very interesting how it leads us to what we're talking about, and how it all evolved into understanding how it came essence, and then how it became political. And here, where I want to discuss what Lawrence was asking about, was pan-Arabism, and I think it failed because there's a great contradiction between nationalism. And here I would like to quote Gellner, who theorized that states became because these people wanted a mass who had a certain understanding, but a unified one, to become a state. And that's why I think the basis of a nation state was based on identical people thinking the same, being under mass education and a mass system that believed the same. And that's why this contradicted when the European, and this as I go to what Osama said about the Westphalian agreements, and then when they talked about that, and then modernity came in, and now they're having contradictory, so the powers are having all these contradictions. First they come up with nation states where they want everybody educated in the same system, like a warrior would fight for something that is completely not connected to anything but fighting for a nation, fighting for a life. And this is what was also argued before Gellner as well. And then it connects to modernity, where I say we want a diverse community. It's like, for me, it's like a declaration that a state would claim that we are diverse, we contain everybody, where the basis is connected into, this is uniform. You are diverse until you are not, until you are different, until you are. And now the question that poses now we're in Europe, where there are refugees from everybody in the world, where Europe is not accepting this kind of refugees. And we're talking about, and I was talking to, today to my sister as well in the US, and she was talking, like I heard people saying to me, go back home, go back from where you are. And then she thought, but you're not from here as well. So if you go home, I would go as well. So I think in general, what I want to say, identity is, because there's a difference between the mainstream, the people, the communities who would hear from the references they had, the references from the attributes they had, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's religion, whether it's spiritual, whether it's political, and then became what shaped who we are. And then deciding for ourselves is not as easy as, like easy said, but not done. I can say something, but I'm controlled in an environment and a background where it controls me, and it dictates where I would go. But then at the end, there's a choice I want to make. Like the Arabs, they made a choice. They say we want to talk about pan-Arabism, but in fact, they chose the other way because it served their political agendas and other agendas, which contradicted with being Arab at the same time. Because it's very contradictory to say Arab, and then going back to what Luay was saying, it's not an Arab nation. What do you mean by Arab nations if you have non-Arabs who are oppressed there? But like they're forced to say they're in the Arab nations or in the Arab world. So for me, it's, again, like I started with, it needs to be broken down and looking at these from different perspectives where we listen to that, and we don't conform also to the, and we don't analyze it from one state, like how it is in the Arab world. It's like we want to say this piece of land, this region, how was it done? And I would also denote at the last thing that Angie said, it's about Lebanon. So for example, when I went to Lebanon, it was really amazing. I felt like, I'm Palestinian, I come from the Holy Land, but when I went to Lebanon, I felt like I was in a Holy Land. Like for me, spiritually, because the Arab Christian history and heritage and intellectual heritage is so ingrained into Lebanon that you would believe this is the Holy Land for me. And for a second I said, Laila, remember, you're Palestinian. You just came from the Nativity Church and the Holy Sepulchre. But then it's different because it connected more to my Arab Christian identity. Because like Osama said, for me in Palestine, it's more connected to the Pope, to Rome. And then I keep reminding myself that Christianity started in Jerusalem, but then the move of it, the politics of going to Rome with the Romans, etc., has changed my perspective. And that's why people have felt the need to connect to something that's not actually me. So I don't connect to Rome as much as I connect to the Levant area. And even to Armenia, when I went last year as well, when I found the history of the start of the Christianity and the church, etc. And this is why I felt I belonged if I had the belief. And that was what was important. And it's not easy for everyone to do that because you're born somewhere where you're forced to think 1, 2, 3 and not the other way around.
Thank you, Laila. I noticed Saman had a disagreement about one of your points, that identity is a choice. Perhaps he can elaborate on that before Lawrence comes in with his question, and then we move to Jonathan. Saman, can you unmute your mic?
It's now okay.
Yes, thank you.
So الهوية هو اختيار صح؟
ما في مشكل مرحبا.
So yeah, I would like to have a comment about that. It can be identity choice. So I don't know if now I can't speak Arabic, so I consider as Arab. So I think it's based in a philosophical, let's say, the understanding maybe, but actually something, let's say, God gave us. So our language, our, let's say, custom, our, the condition of the nationalism, I think something we received from the God, isn't it? Anyone to comment about?
I can answer you with a more difficult topic we haven't actually put on the table today. The question is, I don't know if we can choose an identity, but I know we can reject one. I can reject an identity I was given at birth, whether it's national, whether it's religious, whether it's sexual. And this is how we identify in the first place. I can reject being identified as a woman. God forbid, I love being a woman. But I think we can embrace our identities, we can reject them, and we can choose other identities. And this is, I think it's possible, because these are, for me, they're all made up there is a biological composition to humans, but in the end, time has proven, for me at least, that identity can be chosen, but you can also reject an identity that does not fit who you are. Whether it's gender, whether it's religion, whether it's anything that you might think of. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's you made everything, clear, and truly I agree. So, sometimes for me, as let's say, if I what's the problem? I'm a Kurd. Till now, I don't have, let's say, my freedom, my blah 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 in area located in between I'm sorry about that, Arab, Turk, and even the Persian, the Irani. So it's still question, but if I choose my identity, let's say, or even my gender and religious point, blah blah, if I really wanted to live life. I mean, fully wonder might I choose other one. So here really a point, but yeah, what I wanted to say, yeah, it can be choice, yeah, but it's really hard to
Do you not think
how
it?
I mean,
deny my let's say identity as a court. So if my it's gonna be hard, really. Yeah.
well, we're both freedom fighters, so I understand where you're coming from. It's really difficult when you have to fight for basic stuff in your life as well. So I totally understand.
Yeah.
And I think that highlights the fact that we are free and rightfully, it's our right to choose how we identify, but sometimes that choice is a privilege.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, a nice one. That's a very nice point. Lawrence, you had a question.
Yes, thanks. Actually, Shatha just mentioned something I was going to say. I think about, no, you said it more succinctly, apropos what Laila said, which is ideally we should have a choice. We could apply, fluid identities. But I also think we make that choices as individuals. And then there's the family, the extended family, the hamullah, the religion, and everybody else is looking at you. So if I were to become Catholic or Muslim or something, what would my mum say? And everyone, we all know that situation. No, the point I was going to make originally, just a quick joke just in between. It's a true life adventure. Apropos what Angie was saying, I've got a friend who's a professor from Algeria, and he teaches in Colorado. And every day the attendant there was a Mexican guy. He kept on speaking to him in Spanish, and eventually the Mexican, assuming the person, because my friend has a moustache like that, he looks like Pancho Rivera or whatever. So he used to speak to him in Spanish, and my friend couldn't answer, of course. So eventually the Mexican guy got furious with him and said, "What's wrong with you? Aren't you proud of your ancestry?" And he said, "Yes, I'm proud of being an Algerian Arab." So, it's just the way people perceive you from the outside can be completely wrong. My point, to try and make it simple, is about the Arab nationalism, which pan-Arabism, which reminds me that we often look at issues in binaries. We sort of see Sykes-Picot is bad, therefore whatever is against Sykes-Picot must be good. But of course, the image I have in mind is the border between Iraq and Syria was knocked down by ISIS. So, they did the right thing, but for the wrong motivation. My main point about pan-Arabism is I was wondering why has it not succeeded? I think the answers sort of come out to some extent.
And I can add other factors, but if there is time.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear. I mean, the one point I was going to make was, of course, 400 years ago, the whole Middle East was one block. Everybody was an Ottoman subject. Some were Muslim, some were Christian, some were Maronite. Some spoke Arabic. We spoke about passed on memories. Of course, people who are Arabic were writing Arabic for 400 years. It didn't affect their identity. In fact, it enhanced it. And yet, politically, it was off the table. The point I was going to make is when the Ottoman yoke, as it were, was lifted, and then later the European yoke, and then in the question of Israel and Palestine, there's that whole issue as well. But for the most part, the Middle East had the Ottoman yoke taken off it. Then everybody wanted to be, there was a move for pan-Arabism. But the problem, I would hazard, is each and every center would say, well, actually, Syrians would say, we're the quintessential Arabs. This should be Greater Syria, Bilad al-Sham. People in Saudi Arabia would say, no, we've got the two holy places. We should be the leader. In Libya, as you well know, Libyan people, they felt we're the leaders. So it's a little bit like the European Union, which maybe the Germans and the French agree to disagree and say, actually, we're the leader, and Britain certainly isn't. But that's basically the nature of the problem. It's to make a large collaborative venture, but in whose image is it? is it really possible to have an aggregate of everybody's desires? Probably not so. Thank you.
That links in nicely to Jonathan's point, which I'd be very fascinated to hear about the distinction between the European national identity and the Islamic, or Arab rather, regional identity, and perhaps the pan-Arab identity. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll try and put it in just a couple of minutes. There's been several references to the nation state and to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which is generally recognized as the moment when the European powers recognized that they had rights over their own people within their own borders and nobody should interfere. I think what's often missed is actually this was also, if not mainly, about personal power. It was kings and princes basically drawing lines and saying everything inside that line is mine, keep out. And interestingly, that concept of the nation state then became a template as the process of decolonization went on. In large parts of the world, particularly in much of Africa, the borders that were left by the colonial powers are completely illogical, often running across ethnic divisions. But the leaders of those new states quickly decided they shouldn't question the borders because that would lead to war. And moreover, they rather liked the idea that they could be the equivalent of a king or princeling and create a form of national identity, which basically was this is mine, stay out. And then they had as much personal control as possible. And I would argue, others might disagree, that pan-Arabism, as promoted by Nasser and others, basically failed because it came into conflict with that basic wish, not just of Syria, but of other Arab countries that were saying, well, it's all right being pan-Arab and we'll give some nods toward that. But basically, we like the idea of our nation state because we can control it. In some cases, we can control its oil and other resources, and that therefore the nation state has continued and probably will continue for quite a long time, despite the fact that there are quite justifiably attempts by several regional groups and ethnicities to break away. And of course, the one interesting case in Africa that succeeded was Eritrea, which broke away from Ethiopia, which perhaps could be a sign of what may happen in other areas.
So are you saying that the reason that pan-Arabism failed is because pan-Arabism ultimately tried to use a European template and build on that in order to bolster? So Arabs like Abdel Nasser tried to emancipate themselves and empower themselves, but they tried to do that through a European paradigm. Is that kind of the gist of
No,
the
not
argument?
exactly. No, what I'm saying is that pan-Arabism was challenging the concept of the nation state as the most important aspect of identity, but it was like a train crash into the reality of the nation state and the fact that too many leaders, whether it was the Syrians or others, were determined to hang on to their own national identity.
Okay, that's interesting. So I have one other question about this. Does this mean that do you believe that realism as a political science dynamic is applicable to the Arab world as well as the European world, because we've now adopted the nation state system?
Gosh, it's a big question. I think, what's happening in the Arab world at the moment is very interesting, because although, yes, the nation state system was adopted, we're living through a period of dramatic change in the Arab world. I hate to use the expression the Arab Spring because it was a lazy journalistic description of what happened at particularly in 2011. I said at the time, this is going to go on for 20 or 30 years at least, and then we'll be able to see the changes that have come about, particularly as a new generation takes over, as much of the movement was led by young people, because the nation state is actually more the held in high regard by those of an older generation in the Arab world who actually have the power. And so it'd be very interesting to see what now happens as these waves of social and political change take place. So I wouldn't try to stick the label of realism or anything else on what's going on. It's still happening, and we'll see what comes out at the end.
I don't know there's a label for what's going on terrible right now. We will discover in 20 years, like you said.
Annalisa Rice says it is a friendly, how does it? Friendly creative chaos? Creative friendly chaos. I forgot how it goes. Either creative friendly chaos.
Creative dissonance.
Something along those lines about like what's going on in
Creative and friendly.
Because she said like we want to create a creative friendly chaos.
Yeah, we're controlled beaker.
About what Jonathan said, I could see you reacting quite heavily. So what's your...
My reaction was not to what Jonathan said. I agree with Jonathan. My response is to realism. Realism, like no, like that lens just doesn't work. Empirical evidence, empirically speaking, realism, balance of power, that just there's no empirical evidence to support it, especially when it comes to like from an international relations perspective between states. Just I am pro power transition theory, so, and I think there's a lot more empirical evidence that support it. So, and then I mean that's a whole other discussion that we think we should do for another day. But after realism, like no.
Yeah, we can make a discussion on what IR theory applies the best to the Middle East.
Yeah, we can do that as a discussion. Yeah, definitely.
You see how we've been doing these talks every Friday, like we end with something so intriguing to use for the next one.
So
may I jump in?
Please do please jump in. Yeah.
So with every matter, we have to dig and dig and dig and dig to get to the core. And the core of what we're talking about right now is suppression. Direct or indirect. It's either direct suppression and injustice and imposing an identity on people, or indirectly by having a generation that did not directly get impacted by this injustice and imposed identity, and they experience a loss of identity. How do we tackle this? By acknowledging and admitting the suppression, understanding the means of suppression. Like for instance, in Libya, Amazigh or anybody was not allowed after Gaddafi, not allowed to even name their kids their own language names. I mean, come on, Princess what was it called? Princess Consuela Banana Hammock, right? Phoebe Buffet. And then after we identify the means, we look for ways to bring sustainable justice. Now, something very small that we can start with. Is it okay to call Arabic-speaking countries as Arab world, as part of the Arab world? Why don't we call English-speaking countries the British? And that's where I want to end.
Interesting point.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. That's actually a very interesting concept, and sustainable justice. I think that we should, Osama, I think we should probably do something about that in one of the next topics about sustainable justice, and especially in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Let's not just call for peace. We want to call for just peace. So I think that's something we probably need to talk about. I really like that term, sustainable justice. But I think that we went way over time, and I think everybody still has so much to say. But maybe we should do something. We could talk about this in a different way for next Friday. Something we can have a topic of sectarianism, because I think Laila said something that we didn't even touch on sectarianism, on identity, that is, especially in the context of sectarian politics going on and rivalry in the region. That would be something very interesting to speak about. But unfortunately, we have to go and part our way till next Friday. Right, Osama?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'll put a poll out on our Twitter page at ArabBureau.org, and you can pick the topic next week if you want to join. So yeah, thank you very much everyone for your participation.
Let's take a photo before everybody goes.
Sorry, say that again?
We should take a photo before everybody goes so that we use it, right? Like marketing. Okay, everybody smile.
Hi, everybody. Ciao, bye.
Awesome.
Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Nice to meet you all. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Bye.
Nice to see you, John.